Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this Budget 101 presentation, this virtual Budget 101 presentation. We've done this a couple of times in person now, and we're going to do it a couple of more times. And we're excited to talk it through. Let me introduce ourselves on the town side. I'm Carey. I'm the town administrator here in Brookline. Melissa
Hi, I'm Melissa Goff. I'm the Deputy Town Administrator.
and Christina.
I did.
Oh, can we hear you?
Good afternoon, Christina Metcalf, Communications Officer for the town.
Thanks. And Melanie, you want to say hi? She may not be in a space where she can. But thank you all for joining us. I want to start just by saying we are recording this, and we welcome any questions that you might have during the presentation. If you just use the hand raise feature on Zoom, you go to that react button, and then you go down to the bottom there. It says raise hand, and you do that, your hand will pop up like that. Go ahead and use that feature to let us know if you have a question. And when we get to a good stopping point, we can stop, take that question, and keep going. And there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. So if you want to hold questions or come back to something later, that's no problem. Just please let us know. If we're talking too fast or too slow, we have captions on here. Please let us know on that front as well. Other than that, we'll get going here and talk a little bit about the town and its budget and what it means as a practical matter for the people who live and work here. So let me share my screen. Okay. This is the Budget 101 presentation. And to kick it off, I want to talk about municipal finance in 90 seconds. So when we talk about municipal finance, what we talk about is this blanket term for all of our ongoing planning, budgeting, accounting, and evaluation of the town's financial resources. That's municipal finance writ large. The budget itself lasts for one fiscal year. So it goes, and our fiscal year runs from July 1st through June 30th of the subsequent year. So right now we are in fiscal year 26. That will last until June 30th of this year. And July 1st of 2026 will begin fiscal year 2027. A capital improvement plan is a 6-year plan that we develop for capital expenditures. And capital expenditures are things like buildings, playgrounds, big ticket items, and how to pay for them. The first year of any capital improvement plan becomes part of the annual budget. So when we present the FY27 budget, we present a 6-year plan, but the first year of that plan is what we'll be talking about implementing in the subsequent fiscal year. So the financial plan, which is online at Budget Central on the brooklinema.gov website, is the document that our office publishes that incorporates the budgets for all the municipal departments, the schools, the capital improvement plan, the assessments that we pay and receive from the state and the county, and all the other funds and budgets that we rely on, such as enterprise funds, revolving funds, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we go down the line here. Here's the timeline for how a budget gets put together. The fiscal year begins in July, and we have a couple of months in the summer to kind of gear up, and then starting in September in the fall, the next year's capital improvement plan requests are already due from the departments. Then their operating budgets are due in October. We have meetings where we go over the budget with every single department. We talk about what we think we're going to have in terms of revenue and how it meets the growing expenditures that the departments are facing. In December, we present a forecast to the select board and the advisory committee. We'll talk about those bodies in a second. At a budget summit at the end of the calendar year, there's also the preliminary presentation of the capital improvement plan. February 15th is usually when our office has to submit this financial plan, which is really the sort of starting gun for the main budget season. It's at that point that we have to put out a proposal for what we think the budget will look like, how much we think each department is going to get, how much we're going to get in revenue, and so forth. Then the advisory committee, which we'll talk about, begins reviewing that budget, and it is ultimately the advisory committee that presents the budget as revised to town meeting, which this year will begin May 26, 2026. Town meeting is the town's legislative body, and they're the body that ultimately passes the budget. So the budget is a financial plan and a strategic plan, right? It reflects the community's priorities. It's legally required, so we must do this every year, and town meeting must approve it. It is limited by law to 1 year. We can't pass multi-year budgets, and it must be balanced. We cannot run a deficit, except in very limited circumstances. And really, the only one that concerns us as a municipality is we can run a deficit when it comes to paying for snow and ice removal. So all the work you've been seeing out in town for getting rid of the snow and ice that's on the streets is being paid for through deficit spending. But ultimately, that has to come into balance at the end of the fiscal year. So to the extent that we can deficit spend, it's for a very limited period of time and for a very limited purpose. So the budget process is in players. I'm the town administrator. Brookline doesn't have a charter. The closest thing it has is a law that was a state law, a special state law that was passed called the Town Administrator Act that defines kind of what my job is vis-a-vis the select board. The select board is the chief executive body of the town. Some communities have mayors, a single chief executive. The Brookline as a town has a board as a chief executive, a board of 5 people. And my role, is roughly equivalent to that of a chief of staff in a community that has a mayor. I'm not an elected person, I'm an appointed person. And the select board sets the policy of the community, and it's my job to help implement that policy. So as part of that implementation, the law requires that I prepare a proposed financial plan, and I must submit it by February 15th, unless the governor is late with her budget, which is usually happens only when there's a new governor. So the advisory committee is a required finance committee under Massachusetts law. They are independently appointed by the town moderator, who is another townwide elected official. The town moderator runs the town meeting, and they appoint the advisory committee. That body contains up to 30 members, and it's charged with evaluating and making recommendations to town meeting on what the budget should be. It is the advisory committee's budget, ultimately, at the end of the day. They are listed as the sponsor. It's their motion. Theoretically, people can submit amendments, but generally speaking, the select board and an advisory committee like to be in line with each other when it comes to the question of what the budget looks like. And we talked about town meeting. There are 255 town meeting members elected from the 17 precincts of Brookline, and then there are also other members, including the 5 members of the select board, any statewide elected representatives that live in the community. And so as a result of that, you usually have a little over 260 potential eligible voters at Brookline's town meeting at any given point. And the town meeting, I should say, usually meets twice a year. They're required to meet annually, but they usually call a special meeting in the fall so that if there's other things that need to be done, laws that need to be passed or amended, or the budget needs to be amended, there's an opportunity to do that on a regular basis. We talked a bit about the select board and their role as chief executive officer. There is also a townwide elected body called the school committee. In Massachusetts, the schools and the other municipal operations are held separate from each other. You do not have the select board running the schools. You have a separate body in charge of that. And the school committee in Brookline is 9 members. And while town meeting says what the ultimate amount of money the schools get is every year, they don't get any say in how to spend it. That is left to the school committee. So town meeting could say to the school department, okay, your budget this year is $150 million, but they can't say, and we'd like you to spend that on, new classrooms at the high school. They don't have the authority to condition the appropriation in any way. That's up to the school committee to determine how to spend that. The school committee appoints the superintendent. The superintendent is roughly equivalent to my position. The difference is the superintendent has more authority in terms of programming, in terms of what people are learning, how the process goes on that front. But by and large, our positions are roughly equivalent. The superintendent implements the policies and procedures of the school committee, and I implement the policies and procedures of the select board. The town school partnership is something that Brookline started in the 90s. In other communities, in other areas, there can be tension between the town and the schools, all the other municipal departments and the schools because of this question of, the bottom line authority, how much money do you get? And that can sometimes in those communities lead to fights at their respective town meetings where the schools might say, we need more money, or other town departments might say, we need more money, and we want to take it out of that budget. And so what Brookline did to avoid this is create this town school partnership that meets regularly. It has members from the select board, the school committee, and the advisory committee. And it's their job to ensure that the processes by which we allocate money to the schools and the rest of the municipal departments is fair and reflects the community's needs. And so there aren't those tensions or fights on the floor of town meeting. People understand this is the money we have. This is the process that we use to split it between the schools and the rest of the town. And they have confidence that that's fair and equitable when it comes to how those things are done. And we'll talk a little bit about the town school split, the revenue split, and how that money is allocated a little later on in this presentation. This is a big wall of numbers. This is the FY27 budget. And you can see that it balances, right? We have a total expectation of revenues of $481 million and change, and total expenditures of $481 million and change. And you can see how those numbers are changing. You note that the big ticket item that people are often concerned about, which makes up most of our revenue, is property tax. You can see how that has gone up 5.1%. We will talk a little bit more in more detail, but under Massachusetts law, municipal property tax can't go up by more than 2.5% every year, plus a factor for what's called new growth, basically a calculation that lets you add a little bit more to that percentage based on how much new development has happened in the community. In Brookline, that number is usually between 0.5% and 1%. This year, it's around between 0.7 and 0.8%. So where does that change come from? How do you get to 5.1%? Well, the way that you can get around that cap, which is called the Proposition 2.5 cap, because it was passed by a ballot referendum back in the 80s, in the early 80s, 1982. So, Prop 2.5. The way you get around that is by a community vote. And you can either have the community vote to increase property taxes permanently, or you can have them increase property taxes temporarily for a special purpose. And in Brookline, there have been a number of votes to temporarily increase property taxes for a special purpose, particularly school buildings, but also fire stations. So right now, the town is taking on a lot of debt in order to pay for the new Pierce School, the completed new Driscoll School, the renovations to our fire stations, and so forth. And all of that is being paid for directly out of a temporary property tax increase. So that's why the property tax increase this year, even in the absence of a vote to further increase it, would be at 5.1%. But you can also see what's driving our costs down in the expenditures line. The municipal department growth, in terms of its allocation, is only up 2.5%, up less than 2.5%. School departments is down as well. The non-departmental number, which is costs that are often shared between the town and the schools, is up a whopping 10.8%. And most of that is in healthcare. The healthcare costs for this community have gone up by double-digit figures pretty much for the last 2 years, and will continue to go up by double-digit figures by our estimates going forward. There's no immediate relief in sight. There's no getting around it. We have to provide healthcare to our employees. The cost of providing healthcare is very high and continues to kind of cause struggles, not just for this community, but for many communities around Massachusetts. It is a budget buster. And because we don't have a lot of control over it, there are serious issues that we then have to take into consideration when it comes to how we pay for other things. So I want to turn it over here to Melissa to talk a little bit more about how about our revenues, where they come from, and how they are gathered.
Thanks, Chaz. So this is a pie chart that basically illustrates some of the funding sources that we use for the budget. The largest being property tax, which Chaz just discussed. And then we'll go through the other categories like local receipts and state aid, et cetera. So we can go ahead and flip to the next slide. So property tax is 72.6% of our budget. So that is a large component. There are pluses and minuses associated with that. I think that having that as such a large revenue source provides a lot of certainty, and we can, pretty closely anticipate what we're going to be getting out of the property tax, whether it comes from the natural levy increase of 2.5 and then the estimates for new growth as well. But that also means that because it's a fixed item, there's not really a lot that we can do to grow it beyond what we're constrained to do. So that's why we look at these other categories and see if there are opportunities to grow the other sources of revenue as well. So why don't we go ahead and go on to the next slide. So local receipts, this is another area that we are able to use to try and capture additional revenue. These are things like fees and fines and charges for specific town services. So as an example, if you wanted to run a business in Brookline and you needed a liquor license, in order to open your business, it requires inspections from our health department, our fire department, our building department. So we charge for those services. We charge for those inspections, and then we also charge for the issuance of a license, which also requires a lot of oversight by the town. Another example is if you stay in a hotel in Brookline, there's a local option, hotel motel excise tax. And we're able to capture that. The state has their own excise tax for hotels, and then the town also has a local option as well. If you need to renovate your home, you need to engage with the building department, and there's a lot of oversight that's required with that. And so we issue building permits in order to be able to capture that as well. So these are just some examples of local receipts, but a lot of those are still constrained because, especially for fees and fines, we are only able to capture what it costs us to provide the service. Otherwise, it would be a tax, and we're not able to do that with our local receipts. So why don't we go to the next item? So we have state aid. So the state provides support to municipalities through two primary ways. The first is through what's called unrestricted general government aid. Affectionately, we call it UGA. And that is essentially general aid for cities and towns, and that can be used for any purpose. And then we have what's called Chapter 70, which is education-related aid, and that is also provided on a specific formula distributed to cities and towns. For Brookline, we're what's called a minimum aid community. So the state has targets at through the foundation formula that they provide through Chapter 70 on what we're able to receive. And then there are other income levels and other things that factor into that. And so Brookline gets a limited amount of state aid because of the way the formula works and how it gets distributed to cities and towns. Then we have other state aid for things like abatements for seniors and veterans. That's also what gets provided through what's called the cherry sheet. The cherry sheet is what the term for state aid. It's an old throwback to when the state aid was provided to cities and towns. It used to be printed on a pink sheet, so it was called the cherry sheet, and it's still being referred to that to this day as well. So that's 5.5% of our revenue. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. So then we have this item that's called free cash. And we always joke that it's not free and it's not cash. Essentially what free cash is the prior year's surplus that then we traditionally use for the following year's budget. So this could be coming from a couple of areas. It's either revenues come in higher than we anticipate, or expenditures come in less and there are surpluses in certain accounts that then get closed out to what's called free cash. And we'll have a slide that talks about the way that the town treats free cash. but we treat this as a one-time source of revenue, because it's not always guaranteed that if you had a surplus in an account, that surplus would happen the following year. An example would be if you had maybe a vacancy in a department that wasn't filled for half the year, but the second half of the year it did get filled. Well, you've got some salary savings from that first half savings, and that falls to free cash. But if you're anticipating that position is going to be on the rolls for the entire year, the following year, that surplus will no longer be available. That's why we consider it to be one-time in nature. Another example would be our reserve fund. Last year, we didn't have a heavy snow year, so we didn't need to lean on the reserve fund as much as we likely will have to do this year, given the blizzard and all of the expenses that we're accruing from these storms. So free cash is volatile, and we try and use it very cautiously on one-time items. We can go ahead and go to the next slide.
We had a couple of questions in the Q&A.
Okay.
One is, what is the split between commercial property tax receipts and residential property tax receipts?
So our commercial tax base is less than 10%. So we're a very highly residential community. That's part of why there is a lot of pressure on the residential tax bill, is that we don't really have a diverse commercial area to help ease the burden on taxpayers.
And that's important too, because we can shift the burden of taxes more onto commercial property than on residential property. There's a special factor that we can use. Basically means that per $1,000 of assessed value, we can shift that over more to commercial as opposed to residential, and that helps us keep residential taxes low. So it is important for Massachusetts communities to diversify their development. That's also why, after Prop 2.5 passed in the 80s, communities like Cambridge did very well, and communities like us did not. Communities like us had to make really serious cuts because we were not able to absorb the growth in our expenses was capped in such a way that we couldn't rely on our commercial tax base to cover those costs. The other question was, where do payment in lieu of taxes by charities or nonprofits get captured?
So those are also under local receipts. Those are voluntary agreements that the town has with certain nonprofits to pay a portion of what they would have paid in property taxes. These are voluntary agreements. Nonprofits do not need to pay property tax, but they acknowledge that the town does provide services, whether it be public safety or public works. So it is an effort for them to acknowledge the contributions that are required in order to provide service to these institutions as well. Why don't we go ahead and, okay, so this is when we have free cash, we essentially have a fiscal policy that dictates how we allocate it. And what we are trying to do is make sure that we are preserving our AAA rating by having sound fiscal policies that shore up our overall financial position. And free cash, the utilization of free cash is a major component of that. So the first thing that we use free cash for is to support the funding of our operating reserve. We have a reserve fund that is for extraordinary or unforeseen events. It is overseen by the Finance Committee, by the Advisory Committee, and 75% of that funding is coming from general operating funds, and 25% of that funding is coming from free cash. After we address that, we look at our overall fund balance position. We try to make sure that we have sufficient funding in our overall reserves. The ratings agencies pay very close attention to that because they want to make sure that we have liquidity. And so we usually have some funding allocated in order to address those concerns. Then we have the town, for the most part, is self-insured for most claims. We do have some policies for property insurance and vehicles as well, but most other claims we are self-insured. So we have a liability catastrophe fund that helps us address any claims to the town. And there are fiscal policies that dictate the targets for that particular fund. So we use free cash to boost that fund when we have claims that draw down on the overall balance. Then our capital improvement plan. Our capital improvement plan has a few different funding sources. The largest being operating revenue. So 6% of prior year net revenue is helping to fund our overall capital plan. And then we use free cash to boost that number to 8.1% of overall prior year net revenue. And then we also have an affordable housing trust fund. So once we've visited all of the buckets above, and we still have funding left over, and if the affordable housing trust fund has a balance that's less than $5 million, 15% of whatever is not used will go towards the affordable housing trust fund. And we will be making that an appropriation recommendation in fiscal 27. Once all of those have been satisfied, we'll look at other particular funds that may need some support. We have some trust funds around workers' comp, unemployment, injured on duty for public safety employees. We've in the past looked at our overall pension funding and other post-employment benefits funding. And sometimes we'll make recommendations to use free cash to help support the overall funding levels in those funds. Another thing that we've done pretty regularly is also look at the overall capital plan. And, there's always requests that are waiting in the wings, and there's never not a need to help support the capital plan. So a lot of times we'll use free cash to provide additional support above the 8.1% level. Okay, we can go to the next one. So other available funds, these are essentially payments that come from some trust funds that have employees on them. So we have our revolving fund for recreation related programs. We have our water and sewer enterprise fund, and we have our golf enterprise funds. Those funds operate like a business. They pay for all their expenses. And so what other available funds typically is these funds are sending us payments for benefits specifically. So any employee that sits on those funds are also responsible for covering their benefits, and they transmit that to the town via this other available bucket. So we can go ahead and go to the next one. And so then the enterprise funds just show what the overall budgets for water and sewer and golf course are. And that's about 8.5% of the overall revenue picture. We can go ahead and go to the next. I think this, I toss it back to you on this one, Chaz.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. Before we go on, are there questions from the group about revenues? Anything you heard in there? One of the, and you can also, there's a Q&A function. You can use that. You can also raise your hand using that raise hand feature. One of the big questions that I always get on this area of revenues is when we talk about local receipts, right? Local receipts is an area that we historically under budget, and the state actually tells us to under budget local receipts. You can go to the Department of Local, the Division of Local Resources, and that what they will say is municipalities should under budget local receipts because you always need a certain amount of free cash, no matter what. You always are going to need that money for one-time expenses in your subsequent fiscal year. And the state recommends that your free cash be between 5 and 7% of your prior year's revenue. In our case, we're comfortable. We're in that margin. We're between 5 and 7%, and we have been for the last several years, which is good. That's what credit and bond rating agencies want to see. They want to see that we're following sound fiscal policy. And the way that we get there is that we project local receipts in a conservative way. When there have been gaps between the budgets of the town and the schools and the amount of revenue that we have, the easiest thing for people to say is, hey, you got all that local receipts money that you know you're going to get more of than this. Why do you budget it so conservatively? Why don't you take some of that and put it into the operating budget? And the answer is that will cause us to dip below that 5% mark for free cash. And that will mean that we were going to starve that waterfall that Melissa walked through of all the things that we need. And because we're not following the state's policies, recommended fiscal policies, the bond rating agencies are going to look at that and say, well, I don't know if Brookline is really a AAA bond rated community. We're one of 15 in Massachusetts. It's pretty rare. There are 351 communities in Massachusetts, and we're one of only 15 that has that AAA rating. And one of the reasons why we have that AAA rating, even though by some metrics we are not, where the agencies want us to be, is because we have sound fiscal policy. And if we were not a AAA rated community, then we would be paying a lot more in interest on our bonds, and we would have less revenue to go around. So it becomes this sort of self-defeating idea. Oh, we should take more of our local receipts and put it in the operating budget. Well, if we do that, we will have less money overall because we will be paying more of it in debt servicing. And so I know that that's often, sort of a magic bullet that people suggest when numbers are low. Why can't you just use that money? And that's the reason why. It's tough. It's very tough. It doesn't make intuitive sense sometimes, and that's why you see people advocate so strongly, give us that money. But that money is really not up for grabs. That money does go somewhere, and it goes somewhere important. It goes to funding all of those things in the free cash waterfall and in ensuring that we remain a AAA rated community so that we have the necessary money in the first place to spend on the expenses that we're about to talk about. Okay, expenditures in FY27. You can see here that the single largest category is non-departmental. That's those shared issues, shared services. That includes healthcare, our pensions, the other sort of big budget busting items. The school department is around 30% of our expenditures. All the other town departments combined make up around 21%. Then you have these smaller categories Melissa talked about enterprise funds. You can see that number nets out, 8.5 in, 8.5 out. You have special appropriations and non-appropriated, which we'll get to in a minute. When we talk about the schools budget, this is allocated, all costs, including the allocated share of expenses that are funded in other budgets. It includes the reserve for collective bargaining and their wage increases. There are detailed accounts that are created for budget control, but the school committee controls them, right? We talked about this. Ultimately, it's the school committee's decision for how to spend the money they get. And that means that in the event that there is a shortfall between the amount of revenue that we get and the amount of money that we can allocate to the schools, that the school committee is responsible for figuring out how to make that. We got a question in here. What data or evidence do you use to make decisions about how much budget goes towards schools, playgrounds, and other supports for children and families? That's a great question. We look at, we have, for example, when we talk about things like playgrounds, right? We replace our playgrounds according to a schedule. We have a schedule that we set in place and we say, here's how we, here's the expected life of the playground. Here's the expected life of a park. Here's the expected life of, a fire engine or any of those things. And so we have a schedule for what that looks like. And when you look at our capital improvement plan, that 6-year plan, you can actually see that there are sometimes are things that say, later years and can include things that are beyond the scope of the 6-year plan, but that we know are imminent, that we know might either come onto the 6-year plan or need to be covered in some future year. And so we analyze it in that function and try and build out in such a way that we know that we're meeting all of those expenses. And that's the way that 8.1% number that Melissa talked about. We think, generally speaking, around 8.1% of net revenue is the sort of minimal point that you need to get to be spending on capital improvements in order to make sure that all those needs are met across all the departments, not just for children and families, but for all of the municipal needs. This year, that number is actually higher. We're spending more of that because we've identified needs that are coming due this fiscal year that need to be addressed, including things that were placed on hold last year because of budget issues. The biggest one there would be the new Lincoln Schools playground and landscaping. That's in this fiscal year, but it was originally in last fiscal year. It was put on hold and is now being moved into this fiscal year. So we have backup that we need to address, which is why that number is a little higher. But that's a great question. Thank you. On the town side, right? This is everything else. This is the building department. This is the police department, the fire department, Department of Public Works, the Council on Aging, Recreation. You name it. If it isn't the schools, it's in here. And it's appropriated in different categories. So there's line items for personnel, there's line items for services, and supplies, and capital equipment. It includes a reserve for collective bargaining. We'll talk about how collective bargaining works in municipalities and other potential wage increases. We try and give wage increases every year. These last few years have been very difficult because of inflation. But for example, in FY25 and FY26, both union and non-union employees got a cost of living adjustment of 2%. In addition to, we have a pay plan that offers, steps that go up by a small percentage every year up until you reach your maximum step. Not all employees have those. Not all employees have as many steps as others. We try and, we're analyzing that for equity. But ultimately what that means is, the cost of the real cost for our employees' expenses is often is often exceeding the amount that they're getting in wage increases, which makes it difficult to continue to recruit folks. Non-departmental. So this, again, employee benefits, health insurance and pensions, a group called other post-employment benefits. That is basically retiree healthcare. Our operating reserve fund, debt, and other special funds that we cover here. We are trying to pay down our outstanding pension liabilities as we are required to do by the state by no later than 2040. Our target is 2030, and we want to get there sooner so that we can then have that money available to cover our other liabilities. One of those liabilities is the other post-employment benefits, the amount that we pay in retiree healthcare, in order to get to a point where we're not having to, make up for the additional cost of that amount. So all of those are significant cost drivers for us, and we're trying to figure out ways to do that in a way that then puts us on sounder financial footing. But it's our hope currently that we will be able to retire our outstanding back pension liabilities by 2030. Then there will obviously be ongoing pension contributions. It's not like that goes to zero. But then we're going to have to cover those other post-employment benefits, which are also, the liability there is also, more than $100 million, close to 170. So special appropriations, this includes capital improvement. So we talked a bit about how, we have the revenue funded, and then we also issue debt. So not all debt is paid directly by by property taxes. Some debt we cover as part of the regular operating budget. And so that's what we call unexcluded debt. We don't want our unexcluded debt to be too much. We don't want too much of our money to be going to debt servicing, but we do issue bonds for some of these larger projects that we then pay off rather than going to the voters and asking them for that assistance. Enterprise funds, we talked a bit about this, right? It's 1-to-1. And then reserves, those are within the non-departmental. They support the strong bond rating, the stabilization fund, the liability fund. We leave some of our free cash unappropriated so that we have a base to begin the next year's free cash. Again, this is one of those sound fiscal practices that the state recommends that we do. And then non-appropriated. So there are some mandated expenditures and assessments that are added automatically that we don't get to appropriate or not. For example, we are served by the T, and the T every year sends us a bill for our share of the services, and we pay that. We are part of Norfolk County. We are surrounded by other counties, but we are part of Norfolk County by an accident of history. And so we pay Norfolk County assessments every year. Norfolk County has not abolished county government the way that Middlesex and Suffolk counties have. And so unfortunately, that means we are a major contributor to those that county's operations. And it's not like we get nothing out of it. We have a good relationship with Norfolk County, but we continue to say to the broader world it would probably make more sense if Brookline were in either Middlesex or Suffolk County. There are pros and cons to that. A question in the chat is, are we getting anything from Norfolk? Can we suspend or secede? We do get, we get support from them. We got, for example, American Rescue Plan Act dollars were filtered through there, through the county. We have the sheriff's office that supports us. We have, the courthouse here in Brookline Village. That's a county expense. And when there was talk about closing that and moving it to Dedham, the county ultimately listened to Brookline and let it stay. So it's not like we get nothing, and we want to be respectful of the work that the county, the Board of Supervisors does. But realistically, I think it would be better for the community to think about joining a county that we're closer to. Middlesex probably makes the most sense, but Suffolk is also a possibility. Can we do it? Well, it would take the legislature to do it. And the Speaker of the House is currently from Quincy in Norfolk County. So I doubt it. I doubt they will let us go. We pay too much to Norfolk County for Norfolk County to willingly release us. And given where the Speaker is from, I don't see a lot of chance of that happening in the near future. Other questions on expenditures before we move on to this town-school split, which I know is, can feel kind of arcane, but questions come up about it all the time.
Guys, I don't know if you saw in the chat earlier, Charles Homer asked whether or not there had been a discussion of changing the town school split. So I just responded that we have a slide coming on this. So I think here we are.
Here we are. So here's the town school split. This is the rubric that we've put in place to try and avoid these battles over who gets what, and be realistic in terms of how we allocate resources going forward based on needs. So our revenues come in. We have those fixed costs at top, and those include things right like healthcare, pensions, et cetera. All that is taken off the top, and then everything remaining goes through this town school split. When this was first done in the 90s, in 1995, this split was 50-50. And since then, we've revised the formula for it several times. And what it's ultimately resulted in is roughly 59% of revenues going to the schools and 41% of revenue going to the town after shared costs are accounted for. That's based on actual operating costs and what we think is reasonable under those circumstances. Then there are adjustments made for shared services that are carried below what we call below the line, right? So that's fixed cost, as we often refer to that as the line. If it's above the line, it's paid as part of fixed costs. If it's below the line, it's paid for in either the town or the school's operating budget. So the biggest part of the shared services that are paid for on one side or the other are the building department services. The town handles building management for the schools, basically everything except what the custodians do. So, regular, sweeping and cleanup and so forth. We replace the windows, we fix the HVAC, we do the plumbing, the town does all of that for the schools, for the school building. And as a result of that, we assess, because it sits on the town side of the budget, it's a town department. They also do all the town buildings. Every year we assess the schools. We say to the schools, okay, your share of the bill for building maintenance and upkeep is X. Now the school department has to decide whether or not to pay that, and that can be a point of contention because the school department would like to be spending their money on schooling. But the fact of the matter is you have to spend your money on building maintenance and upkeep or your buildings fall apart. And in fact, that is what happened in Brookline in the early 90s before the town school partnership came into effect. Time of scarcity, people were spending money only on things that they thought they absolutely needed. And as a result, for example, there was a fire at the high school. There was a bad fire. And after that, town meeting actually said, okay, from now on, the town is going to manage the buildings and the schools will pay the town to do that. And that was kind of the start of the discussion over these towns of the town school partnership. Can this number be changed? Yes, it can be. I will say that the issues that the town and the schools are facing now are not about the split, right? The split is not what's causing the consternation and the deficits that the town and the schools are seeing in terms of the gap between the revenues that we take in and the growing expenditures that we have. Those are being caused primarily by the fixed costs up above. Those are being caused by healthcare. So you may hear, when you look all the way back, towards the beginning of this, you see, oh, wow, the schools are only getting an increase of 1.2% in their revenues, and the town is only getting a 2.4%. What's going on there? Are we, why are they not getting, more increases if property taxes are going up and on all of those things? And we know that the costs are going up. It's because of that 10.7% number. It's because there's not enough money left after all the fixed costs are accounted for to meet either the town or the school's needs. So shifting the split at this point is not going to solve the problem. It's going to move the problem around. And so I think it's important to think, more holistically about the problem, which is the revenues do not cover our fixed costs, and not think about the split as being part of the problem, because all you were doing there is then allocating the pain. And, both town and schools are already, in the absence of a discussion about an operating override, which we'll talk about in a second here, talking about significant cuts to operations and services. And so trying to, balance that out, I don't think, blowing up the partnership to do so, I don't think is a wise way of handling that. So let's talk a bit about what we mean when we say the community has a structural deficit, right? In basic terms, the growth and cost of things that we need to pay for as a community, like healthcare, like utilities, regularly exceeds the amount of money that we can legally raise in revenue. Right. Again, if you're, the single largest source of your tax base can only go up by between 2.5 and 3.5% any given year, and your healthcare costs are going up by 12%, you can see how that's ultimately going to lead to a problem. So almost every year we have to make hard choices about how to do more with less. And that problem compounds as years go on. You can take a look at this chart here, right? In 2027, revenue projected to go up on balance by around 4.1% overall. Our expenditures are projected to go up by 7.4%. Assume for a second, every year we have to balance the budget, right? So every year that does zero out. And we zero it out by either finding additional sources of revenue or making cuts. But if we were to not do that, if we were somehow able to carry that forward, then you would see cumulatively that budget gap gets wider and wider because expenditures continue to outpace revenues, even in out years. They grow, and eventually, they get to that point where you can see at the end of the slide where by 2031, you're looking at 24.3% growth in expenditures from this current situation and only 15.5% growth in revenue. So Prop 2.5 provides an escape valve for communities that want to raise property tax revenue to address problems like this. And that's called an override because it overrides Prop 2.5's limits and says, okay, taxes can go up by more if the community says yes. Brookline is unique among Massachusetts communities. It has passed more overrides than most. It has offered more overrides than most, and it has passed more overrides than most. And as a result, property taxes have gone up, significantly in the community. But the community has, through the educational process of, explaining to voters why it's necessary and what they get out of it, has historically provided pretty broad support for operating overrides. For example, here are the 5 that the state has records on, and the percentage by which the winning percentage vote in each case. In 1995, there was an override for $3 million, $6 million in 2009, 7.6 in 2016, 6.5 in 2019, and then in 2024, or for fiscal year 2024, passed in 23, there was an override of close to $12 million. At that time, that was the single largest override in Massachusetts history. It has since been eclipsed by Melrose's override last year. Melrose passed a $13.5 million override. Arlington has put a $14.8 million override on the ballot. They vote next month. So we will see how those initiatives pan out. Other communities that have historically not been successful in holding overrides, like Stoneham recently had an override pass. It was a 2-tiered override. They asked, would you be willing to pay $12 million or $9 million? The community said they would be willing to pay $9 million after 7 prior failed overrides. So it's the tenor of the conversation statewide is changing. With that said, Brookline is in a unique place because they've had more overrides than other communities have. And so their taxes have gone up by more than some of these other communities have. And so it's not a one-to-one situation. There's a question about communicating information to town meeting as we consider the Chestnut Hill commercial area. I take that as somewhat rhetorical, but I'll talk a little bit about the Chestnut Hill commercial area in a bit. But that is we'll talk about that as we move on here. So what are the budget busters that are driving on the town side in particular, where we are now? Because roughly between FY26 and FY27, the gap between revenues, the expected revenues that we think are going to come in, and the expenditures that we're going to have to pay for is around $3 million. It's around $2.9 million, assuming we kept everything the same. And that means everything, which includes the fact that we have a huge gap in our fire department's overtime budget, that we currently have 6 vacant police officer positions that we can't fill. So there are things that we are already not doing that we want to be doing, that we have to do in a lot of these cases, like pay for fire overtime, that we're unable to do as part of our operating budget as it is. And even if we were to continue to do it, to kind of limp along in that way, we would still be $3 million in the hole without cuts or raises in revenue. So again, we talked about healthcare. That's the biggest one. The fire department overtime. For the last 5 years, we have gone to that reserve fund that Melissa talked about for a transfer because our fire department overtime has exceeded its budget. There are a lot of complex reasons for this. But basically, changes in law and leave rules have left us chronically under budgeted in that department. There was a change in how we calculated days off in 2018 that we did not budget for in terms of how it would change how overtime is taken. Then there was a decision by an arbitrator saying that family leave for new children, bonding leave, extended to non-birthing parents, regardless of gender. And that led to, we have a young fire department. That led to a lot of people taking more bonding time. Again, that's good. We want people to take bonding time. It's important to have, but it led to a huge amount of overtime needed to then cover those folks as they were out. And we've had an increase in injury on duty. It's just an unfortunate reality in a lot of departments that they have seen, injuries increase in the fire department. And while we have done a good job, and the chief has done a really good job at identifying the sources of that and trying to control for it, we do have a large number of people on injury leave, even though it's going down. And that, again, when you don't have that person, you have to call someone else in. One of the ways that we tried to control for this was having a discussion about potentially doing what other communities do and lowering the number of firefighters on an apparatus. Brookline is the only community other than Boston in our area that requires 4 people on a truck at all times. Other communities allow for 3 people in some or even all situations. Some communities even go as far down as 2 on a ladder. We wouldn't do that. We don't think that's safe. But we raised that idea. The town's position is that it's our management right to say how many people get called to work on any given day. Obviously, the union very strenuously disagreed with that. And we had a lot of feedback from the community that disagreed with that too. We had firefighters picketing outside town hall, picketing outside town meeting, folks very upset. They didn't want to lose the level of service that they'd come to expect. And we said at the time, okay, understand that if we don't do this, the other options are we cut firefighters, we cut the number of people who work for us permanently, which we don't want to do, or we ask the community for more money to cover the level of services that they have come to expect. How do we, question from the participant about how we collect feedback from the community? That's a great question. We collect feedback, ultimately we on staff are accountable to the people who are elected, and then the broader community as well. But the elected officials are answerable to the people, and we are answerable to and we answer to the elected officials. And so, the feedback that we got at town meeting from the advisory committee and ultimately from the select board, from what they were hearing from the community was, wow, people really don't like this idea. People are really upset about it, and they really don't want you to do it. We said, okay, we will not do that. But then people have to understand that that's one less option that we have to control for these costs, and the other 2 options may be even less palatable. With that said, we listen. We want to be very clear that if that's what the community wants, that's what we'll do. And so it is a good question about how we solicit that feedback and figure out how to be responsive to the community's concerns.
Yeah, can I just also add that throughout the budget process, there are public hearings on every departmental budget, both at the advisory committee level and at the select board level as well. And so those are also opportunities for people to express their opinions on the town services and the areas of the budget that they may have concerns or questions about.
Thanks. Yes, that's a good point. And those hearings are actually happening now. They are just starting. You can see the schedule for them on the select board and advisory committees sections of the brooklinema.gov website. So collective bargaining is a big driver on the town side as well. Unlike with other public sector unions, if you are a police union or a firefighters union, police officers union or a firefighters union, if you reach an impasse with the community that you work in, you can ask the state to arbitrate a contract for you. And that's done by a body called the Joint Labor Management Committee. And that process is supposed to take into account both the management side and the labor side. It's supposed to be painful. Communities aren't supposed to like it. It's designed to encourage people to settle with public safety unions. The issue that we experience is that in recent years, the JLMC has gotten significantly more pro-union in its decisions. And it has done things like, in Brookline's case, saying, well, you could probably just pass an override, couldn't you? And you could fund your contracts that way. And when we tell them we don't have the money, they say, well, you could get the money. They also look at other communities, comparable peer communities to us. And, unfortunately, we are close in proximity to places like Cambridge, but we don't have Cambridge's money. So we're competing for the same pool of people, but we don't have the same resources available to us. But that's still something that is taken into consideration by the arbitrators, and that can result in contracts that we have no control over, really busting the budget, and then having to find a way to pay for them. And so when we negotiate, even when we come to successful resolutions with these unions, and we have good relationships with our union leadership. They are very, they're strong advocates, but they're fair advocates for their staff and their teams and what they need. And we work hard to come to solutions that are fair, but we do so knowing that in the background, there's this possibility that we could go to this panel and get an even worse decision. So we do wind up in situations where we are accepting contracts that grow beyond the limits of Prop 2.5, because we know that the state may force us to do so anyway. And oftentimes what the state will force us to do is worse. And then utilities. We are electrifying our buildings, which is great. We are looking to find new ways of covering that. In the budget this year is $3.2 million for new solar panels on 4 different rooftops. The new Pierce School will have solar panels as well. So that's 5 different solar projects that are in progress. And that's really a down payment on a number of solar projects. This is the first step in a broader strategic solar initiative that we're very excited about. But we go through the same pains that people who, for example, have installed heat pumps in their home are going through. Cost of utilities is going up. Cost of electricity is going up. And that means that we pay a lot more in utility bills than we used to. We have these new buildings coming online. We have the new Driscoll School online. And even though that school has geothermal wells to help offset some of the utility costs, which is great, and some solar as well, for one thing, it just doesn't meet the cost of the new building, a larger building. And so our utility costs continue to rise. So what do we do before we go out to the voters, before we even talk about an override? We try and make all the recommendations we can that don't raise taxes. We reduce capital spending, even though this can lead to those backlogs that we were worried about. The select board's policy about how much revenue do we put into the CIP, that capital improvement plan, was at 6.6%. We suggested for this year and for coming years that we lower that slightly. It's not great because that number is tight, and there are all those capital projects that people want to have us do, but the need is so acute on both the town and the school side. Remember, this is above the line. This is an above the line cost, so 59% of this money goes to the schools. We recommended a slight reduction in how we spend on capital projects. We review open positions. Right now, even in a scenario where if we were to pass an override, we would still eliminate 3 open positions on the town side, and we would move 2 more to grant-funded sources. They call those soft money. We don't like doing that. We want to pay for recurring expenses with regular operating recurring funds. But in these cases, the grant source of money is stable, at least in the mid to long range. And we think that that's an appropriate way to try and control for costs in the operating budget. We raise fines and fees. One of the recommendations that's going to be made to try and control for costs, to try and control for expenses this year, is to raise parking ticket costs and motor vehicle fines. Right now, Brookline charges between $25 and $30 for most offenses. We cannot charge more than $50 by state law without a special act of the legislature. So my recommendation to the Transportation Board, who makes ultimately, is the decider on those policies, would be to raise all of our parking and other motor vehicle fines to $40, a flat $40 fee. and that brings in about $1.2 million. We're estimating it would bring in around $1.2 million. We want to spend some of that money on modernizing our enforcement so that hopefully we can see a better return on our investment in terms of how we deal with those problems. And then it goes through the split. So some of that money goes to the schools and some of it goes to the town. Again, we talked a bit about solar panels and increasing renewable energy uses. So if we do all of that, we get around $2 million. But again, that projected gap is $2.9 million. So even in that circumstance, we're still going to have to make almost $1 million in additional cuts just to balance the budget. So the select board last year created a new board called the Expenditures and Revenues Study Committee. And that board has two goals. One is to look at the immediate term issues, the gap between expenditures and revenues, talk about how we got here, and if it thinks it's appropriate, recommend a ballot question of some kind to go to the voters about, okay, we understand why we're at this point. What we would request from the voters is an increase of X amount in property taxes. And they would talk about how to structure it too. Would it be phased in over a certain number of years? Would it be a question similar to that Stoneham question I talked about, where maybe you have a high number and a medium number, or even more numbers, and you say pick one of these, and whichever the highest one is passes is the one we'll adopt. So all of those immediate questions about how to solve this issue are before that committee right now. The other things that committee is considering is what can we do to, tamp down this structural deficit in a meaningful way going forward so that we don't have to keep coming back to the voters as frequently or hopefully at all. How can we find ways to balance our budget given the constraints of Prop 2.5? And they're coming up with, I think, really, engaging proposals, ways of thinking about how we're going to be operating in an environment where our pensions our outstanding pension liabilities are paid off. How we're going to be operating in a world that has more solar energy and more renewable energy, other forms of renewable energy. So that committee's work is going on right now. They're hoping to wrap up a final report by mid-March, so in a couple of weeks. And one of the things, they're considering the two sides of the budget gap right now. There's a town side and the school side. The town, the proposal that Expenditures and Revenues is considering, and I want to stress that this is draft proposal. It's subject to additional review and approval. It is not, it may not be the thing that goes on the ballot. It probably will go through a lot of conversation, both at that committee and then at the select board, because the select board is the only body that can put an override question on the ballot in the first place. So on the town side, here's a proposal for what might be paid for via an operating override. We talk about this continuity of service gap here. That's that number that we were just talking about before, this delta between 2.5 and 2.95, with a slight increase for the number over on your far right there, which we'll talk about, this reserve fund put in place to help cover costs in the out years of a 3-year time horizon. The fire department collective bargaining agreement that we signed with the union has what's called a tail. A lot of the expenses come due on the last day of the contract. And so beginning in FY28, our costs for the fire department just for day-to-day operations will go up almost $1 million. And so we would recommend paying for that using through funds acquired in an operating override. We would similarly try and close that overtime deficit that is expanded over time. It's stabilized now, but it is around $800,000. And so you can see that the fire department makes up $1.7 million of this override. The Department of Public Works has had over the years a number of programs put in place by town meeting. And town meeting has things that it wants us to do, but sometimes town meeting doesn't identify how to pay for them. And so we have to figure out how to make that work. And in this case, for example, last year, town meeting passed a very expansive tree protection bylaw. And DPW, the Department of Public Works, said, that's great, we want to protect trees, but it's going to cost us, more than $200,000 a year to do this kind of work in any meaningful way. Where are we going to get that money from? And town meeting said, well, maybe the fees will balance it out. Unfortunately, that wasn't true. The fees do not balance it out. And so if we want to keep doing that, we need to find a way to pay for it. Similarly, the town is very fortunate. We were ahead of the game in a lot of ways in that we have a new, relatively recent division of sustainability and natural resources. That came about because we were trying to find a way to really operationalize our commitment to get to fossil fuel freedom by the state's deadline, which is 2050, and make meaningful contributions to resiliency and preparing for climate change, doing things like stormwater resiliency, heat resiliency, all of that stuff. Previously in the town, sustainability, we had one person in charge of sustainability writ large, and they were in the planning department. And that was fine, but it wound up being more like a think tank. You would get, reports from the sustainability coordinator saying, wouldn't it be nice if we did this? And then there would be no one to do that because there were no one would take responsibility and do that work. We decided it made sense to move that into the Department of Public Works and change it into a real operational division. So now the people who are actually going out and doing things like, dealing with the drains, dealing with water runoff, dealing with building inspections because there's a reporting relationship with the building department. All of that is integrated with sustainability now. So everything we do has a sustainability connection and is accounted for. And it's not just a think tank out there saying, wouldn't it be nice if? And amongst other things that the sustainability division has done since it came into existence is it has been a huge grant maker for us. It got us certified as a climate leader community by the state, which unlocks more than $1 million in additional funding sources. They have won a number of grants, large and small, to do work like developing a serious climate action plan that is well integrated with our departments, and many more things, big and small, that the community is really asking us to do in terms of being a leader in climate change and climate resiliency. And since we've done this, we've seen other communities follow our model. We've seen other communities say, wow, we really should have sustainability be an integrated part of our operational departments and not just sitting out there issuing position papers. We were able to do this because we received a grant from an anonymous donor. And we styled it as a pilot program. We said, let's try this out for 3 years. And if we think it works, let's find a way to pay for it. It's not terribly expensive when it comes to large scale things. It's around $325,000, which when you consider that the overall Department of Public Works budget is close to 20 million, it's not a huge amount. And what they give back to us, I think, is dollar for dollar really worth it. And so that is out there as part of this override. The community has asked us to focus more seriously on sustainability, and that is where that is coming. That's where that's ultimately going to rest. We have the 6 police officer positions that I talked about that are being held open. That was to help pay for the last police contract. Unfortunately, this has meant that there's been more overtime in the police department because there are fewer officers around. The chief would really like to be back up to a full complement of officers, as would I. And so asking the community for the opportunity to restore those positions through this override would get us back up to a full complement. With the collective bargaining reserve, Melissa talked a little bit about that in our revenues. We want to be putting aside more money, knowing that we have those potential costs coming. We're going to be renegotiating our collective bargaining agreements with the unions. We just want to be ready for it and well insulated so that we can, make those contracts fair and appropriate, and not break the bank to do it. In the police department right now, there are our case management software. The support for it is ending. It's a very expensive piece of software to buy and maintain. So we're trying to figure out how to make that transition. Also, because of the most recent collective bargaining agreement, our lieutenants, which are the highest ranking officers in the union, now make a lot of more money. And it's pretty close to where the deputy superintendents, who are the lowest non-union position, make. And as a result, there's less incentive for folks to say, well, I want to take a management position. I want to move from the union to management. And so we want to incentivize, obviously, leadership and succession planning in the police department. And so trying to figure out a way to increase the salaries of the deputy superintendent and the superintendent in order to make sure that happens. The Council on Aging has been running a medical transit program since the pandemic. It's been extremely successful and extremely popular. It's also currently the last of its kind, as far as we know, in Massachusetts. Other communities experimented with this as well. Newton, you may remember, did a program called NUMO that provided, heavily subsidized or in some cases free senior transportation, kind of writ large. Didn't matter where you wanted to go, how far, how near. And ultimately, what all of these other communities concluded was that that's not sustainable. We were spending federal pandemic dollars to do it. It made sense as a pandemic response when people were afraid to leave their houses and needed safe transit. But the reality of the situation is we need to think about, if we're going to do something similar to this, we need to think about how to pay for it and make it sustainable. So what the proposal is to keep this program going, to subsidize it for low-income seniors so that folks still have that opportunity, that resource, and then simultaneously invest in our admin support and transit support. Right now, our transportation coordinator at the senior center is a part-time employee. We'd like to increase their hours to full-time. We'd like to make them, they already are such an integral part of the team. We want to invest more in that and making sure that seniors have access to transit options. And we want to bring on a position that's currently grant funded in the senior center to the operating side, which then frees up that grant money to be used for programming rather than for people. So in order to keep this program going and not lose it like it's been lost in other communities, we need to invest some money in it. The building department has asked for more money on the town side, and for repair and maintenance, and they've also asked to be able to hire a new plumber. As these more complex buildings come online, the plumbing is more complex and the need is multiplied. And so being able to hire a new plumber would be critical for them, as well as spend more money on repair and maintenance. We did a very good job as a community in not putting too much long-range recurring costs onto federal pandemic-related relief dollars. The two exceptions to that were the Senior Center Transit Program and some of our IT licenses, particularly our Zoom license. The license that we are using to have this conversation right now is paid for via pandemic dollars. That's expiring, and we need to bring some of those onto our operating budget. Not all of them. We're going to have to make some cuts, and IT is going to make some tough decisions about what to keep and what not to keep. But in order for us to do that, in order for us to maintain some of these core services like Zoom, we do need to invest additional dollars in IT's budget. And then last but not least, there's a part-time clerk position in the clerk's office. But there's so much work to be done in the clerk's office that they're already working effectively full-time. The clerk is just paying them extra wages to work more hours. Doesn't make any sense. So we should just make that a full-time position and free up that money for the clerk's office to do the other things they need to do that are community facing, like digitization of records, like providing marriage licenses, and all of the things that we rely on the clerk's office for. All of that adds up to around $5.31 million. We look back at that override from 2023 of roughly $12 million. Of that override, just under $5 million of it was on the town side. It was given over to town needs. The rest of it went to the schools. So $5.31 million actually represents a little less in real dollars when you factor in inflation than the last override for town services. And that's by design. The town is trying really hard to keep its asks to a minimum. This is not a Cadillac override. This is not we want to do new exciting things override. This is a keep the lights on override. This is a Corolla override. We're trying very hard to provide the basic level of services that people have come to expect. And one of the ways that we're doing that, we're trying to lower the overall burden on taxpayers, is through this last line here on the side, this reserve fund. Historically, Brookline has asked, when Brookline has passed overrides, they phased in the amount of taxes. For example, in that override, the 2023 override, even though it was for $12 million, that wasn't taxed all at once. A certain amount was taxed in year 1, a little bit more in year 2, and a little bit more in year 3. And as a result, the impact on people's tax bills was lessened. $5.3 million is roughly a 1.6% increase in the tax levy. That can total out to be a lot for some people and not a lot for others. So we don't want to, generalize and say that's not a lot of money. But when you factor in what the immediate needs are in the first year, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to try and chunk that out into smaller cuts. Um, and um, the and the other part of this is if we then bank some of the money that we don't need in year 1, we can spend that to cover unexpected expenses in years 2 and 3. A big issue that's come up with overrides is, well, the first year goes okay, and then there are unexpected expenses, and the community has to deal with cuts again. And that frustrates people. They say, well, didn't we just pass an override? Why are you making cuts? And so we're trying to build this reserve into the budget to avoid that situation and get us through 3 years and work through and make it so that people feel confident that it was the right amount of money that was asked for, while also actually keeping it a little lower than it would otherwise be if we were to try and phase it in over a 3-year period. So what happens if there's not an override? What happens on the town side if that decision is not made? The answer is pretty tough, right? We would be looking, and I apologize, this is from a prior version of this. The actual number in a no scenario in year 1 for employees is 17.4, not 19. We would lose 17.4 full-time positions in year 1. We would probably lose 20 full-time employees in year 2, and that would be because of that fire issue, that $900,000 on the fire department coming online. The only other way that we see at this juncture to cover that cost would be to basically permanently shut down 1 fire engine, and that would mean laying off 20 firefighters. That is really not what we want to do. I think that is really a last and worst case option. But when you think about $910,000, that's bigger than some entire town departments. The order of magnitude of cuts that would need to be made elsewhere to prevent that from happening is really difficult to countenance, particularly when you have a cost driver in one department and you're asking all the other departments to shoulder that burden. I think it would be a very tough situation to deal with. So absolutely not something we want to do, not something we want to countenance. People say, oh, you're threatening the fire department. You're threatening why are you threatening public safety? I would never threaten public safety. I don't want to be in this position. I think it's a very grim position to be in. But $900,000, $910,000 is an extremely large number to try and make up any other way. So you would be looking also at shortened library hours. We wouldn't be able to keep part-time support for libraries on, so libraries would shut earlier. I don't know how Sunday hours would be impacted, but probably we would lose those. We would close the farmers market program. We wouldn't be able to fund it. We wouldn't be able to do the tree protection enforcement that town meeting has asked us.
Before you keep moving down the list, there was a question in the Q&A about the farmers market program from Charles Hallmark.
Yeah.
And so Charlie, in the prior slide, there was a continuity of services bucket. That's where the farmers market funding would, if it was restored through the override, that's where you would find it.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Melissa. And then, we would likely, ultimately, be shuttering the sustainability division, which means we would lose that solar initiative. We would lose that investment in renewable energy. We would lose all that grant access. We would see fewer economic development projects. We'd have to make cuts in the planning department. We'd scale back language access. We wouldn't be able to implement language, for people who don't speak English in the community, which is a growing percentage of our population. People who really need translation services. We would do our best. We are under a mandate to do that, but we would slow us down significantly. And this isn't even accounting for FY29, where I think you would need to see likely a few more layoffs and additional cuts to services. There's a question in the chat. If healthcare is driving the budget deficit, why don't we just call it what it is, an override because of increasing healthcare costs? Yes, that's true. And that is what we're calling it. And I think you see, you know, when we talk about, we'll go back here a slide and, think about that continuity of service number, right? To keep things as they are. The problem is things as they are already below what the community has asked us to provide. So it is as a result of the healthcare costs eating up all that money above the line. The things that we want to do, that we need to do below the line, we don't have the money for. So it is an override because of rising healthcare costs. The question then of your point of, what's the point of talking about a clerk here or there? I take your point, and I think it's a good one. But I also think it's important for people to understand, if you ask for this money, where does it go? If I say, well, it goes to healthcare costs, that's true in a way, right? Money is fungible. But I want people to understand that these are the things that we are being asked to do that we could not do in the absence of an override. The Senior Center Transportation Program, for example, which people rely on, and it's really critical to the health of the community. If we don't find a way to fund it through tax revenue or something else, then we're not going to be able to do that. And so I certainly take your point. And there is a school of thought that just says, blame it on healthcare and say we need X in order to meet our healthcare obligations. But I think we owe it to the community to explain in more detail. Yes, and here are the obligations that will be met if we have enough money to cover those healthcare costs. So thank you for the question. It's a good one. But I think it's two different ways of thinking about the same problem, which is how do we match our revenues and our expenditures? So that is the end of the formal presentation here. And I want to thank you all for spending this time with us and talking through this and for your excellent questions and comments and thoughts on this. We would love if you would complete this survey to share your thoughts on the budget form and presentation. It would be really great to hear from you on that. And then we want to open the floor to questions, comments, concerns. I will say, if you enjoyed this presentation, if you thought other people would benefit from seeing it, this is being recorded. We posted on the town's website. We're also doing it live again next week at the Baker School on Monday night. We're doing it after that at one of the BHA properties in North Brookline the subsequent week. I'm also going to be appearing on a budget forum on local access television, along with the school superintendent, to talk about kind of budget 101 more generally, and that'll be next Monday afternoon. So there'll be a lot of opportunities to see this again, to hear these thoughts again, to ask questions, to kind of dig deeper and interrogate this whole process about why we are where we are, and where we kind of go from here, what the choices are in the community in terms of where we go from here. So again, thank you. I see we have one hand, Mr. Lynn Jones. Let me see if I can make sure we can get that set up. Sorry, one second. Christina, can we just make sure that Mr. Lynn Jones can unmute and share his screen?
It looks like he's unmuted. So Sean,
okay, there you go, Sean. Go ahead. Sorry, thank you.
Can you hear me then?
Yes.
And you can see me too now, I hope.
Yes.
Okay, good. I'm too verbose to put questions into the chat and quick Q&A, and it's so hard to type on my iPad here. It's hard for me to type anyway, but particularly on an iPad. First, this was great. Just overall, Chaz, it's a shame that more people didn't come. I sent out an email to my entire neighborhood about the budget, about the possible override with this link. And I said, it will be recorded, and I'll send them the recording as well.
Thank you.
I have, one very specific concern that I'll contact you separately about, but I'll flag it now. Wearing my green space hat, which is actually hanging up near here, but I'm not putting it on. I am particularly concerned about the reduction in the tree removal, tree planting CIP item from $540,000 to $365,000, which was even lower than the previous year. And the problem with that is the contractual services are increasing at a fairly rapid rate. And, even less money than last year, it now has to pay for services that are considerably more expensive. And we could certainly talk, offline about the need for tree removal and tree planting. And I know this is a difficult budget, and there's probably another 10,000 items that someone would wish could be higher. But that one really did stand out. And I have talked to both Aaron Shute and Millie Pradhan about this prior to the release of the financial plan, just to get a sense of what was going on. But I have, two, big questions. The first is, not surprisingly, my neighbors are always grumbling about their property tax bills. They would love to see them go down, not go up. And they're well aware, they quote the percentage increase that they've seen since particularly years, and, are quite appalled because this has been a cumulative impact. With the debt exclusions and the operating overrides, as well as the baseline, Prop 2.5 increases. I'm not going to be able to give them your 2.5-hour presentation to try to convince them. But what's the elevator speech to try to persuade that person who's looking at a large bill and a stack of large bills that they really should consider voting for the override as opposed to just saying no?
That's a great question. I think it's ultimately, what do you expect from government? What do you expect the local government to do for you? Do you want to live in a community that provides some of the best schools in the nation? Do you want to live in a community that is a leader in green space that provides all of these services? Do you want to live in a community that has that robust fire protection and robust police protection? Or do you think that we can get by with cutting those services? Do you think we could get by reducing that? Especially when you consider that the things that are driving your costs are not actually the provision of those services, right? It's the things that we have no control over, or very limited control over: healthcare, pensions, utilities. It's not as though we are being profligate in our spending, and that's the reason why. It's not as though we're buying fancy new cars for everybody, and that's the reason why, or that, any of those things are happening. It is that there are, in the same way that they are experiencing fixed costs go up, we are experiencing fixed costs going up. And that's the ultimate balance that we have to strike. It's very hard. I would not pretend in the slightest that, that it's easy, or that it makes, it's a bitter pill to swallow. Even in areas where you have the residential exemption, where you have the opportunity to bring those to mitigate those taxes in some way, it's very difficult. But I think at the end of the day, it is the cost of doing business is going up, and in the absence of an commensurate increase in taxes, the services you come to expect will denigrate, will go down. And even if you don't personally use those services, even if you don't have children in the schools, Brookline relies on its reputation as a destination in order to generate the kind of growth that we actually need. I think, this is now a long elevator pitch. You're on a tall building.
Got to work on making the elevator speech short. And
yes.
I can empathize with this problem. I know. I talk too long as well.
Yeah. Thank you for your question, though.
I do have
yes, one more. Sorry,
one other question, but maybe Priscilla should go first, and she does
Sure.
have.
I
don't know how much time you have, but I want to make sure she can get hers in.
I have whatever time you need.
Go ahead, Priscilla.
You should be able to unmute yourself and share your screen if you're comfortable.
Okay. I don't know if I'm.
There we go. We can hear you. Yep.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you for taking the moment to listen to me. And I was the one who not asked the question, but said we should tell people what really the issue is. Many people live in Brookline because of the medical community, both on the business side and on the healthcare side. We have a real opportunity as a community in this country to try to figure this issue out. And I think we should. I totally understand that the services result of the services, but this truly, this affects all of us everywhere in the country, and let's really let the constituents know that we can figure this out. If we can't figure it out, then nobody can figure this out. That's my answer, and I guess my response, just not response, when I'm listening. I live in a condo on Longwood Avenue, with one parking spot, and I think our taxes are incredibly reasonable. So I think we have to. I always have thought.
So is there a way, if we get a business who?
Oh, Christina,
say
can you,
wants to
I'm sorry,
avail-
Ms. Kowski, we had
So
a,
what is,
Yep.
there we go. Sorry about that. Sorry,
Yeah.
please continue. You were talking about your condo.
I was just saying that I do think that the services that the taxes that we pay as a family over 35 years have been incredibly fair. I don't want to say fair, and because our backyard is the community park, is Lawrence Park, and so we all can't forget what we expect for ourselves versus the community. That's just my comment. And let healthcare be known, and let's figure it out. Thanks.
Thanks very much for coming and for your comment and your thoughts on that. I see Yukiko Egozi, and then Mr. Lynn Jones will come back to you there.
Oh, oops. Hello. Yes, thank you very much. It was very helpful. I think I heard Mr. Lynn Jones say that there will be a recording available. I just wanted to find out whether the charts at the end of sort of the services that will be provided with the proposed override, all of that was very helpful to me. I was wondering if there's a way for me to share them with community members.
Sure. We'll post those slides on our website. If you go to the Select Board's website or the Budget Central website, either of those should have it on there. You can also see that in the, if you go to the Budget Central part of the town's website, there's actually a longer presentation about the financial plan, and those slides are in there as well. And they talk about, the override, potential override in a little more detail. So those are either of those are a good place to grab those slides from.
Great. Budget Central. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay, Mr. Lynn Jones, you're back.
Okay, I had another sort of difficult question that people ask, and it's the question about, can we count on the town and the schools to spend the override funds as promised? And I actually went back and looked at some old budget messages, and I found statements like, our obligation is to fulfill the promise of the 2009 override effort.
Yeah.
We have shown tremendous responsibility in honoring the commitments made during the 1994 override campaign, a record that should provide solace for those concerned about where the potential fiscal 2009 override monies would be expended in future years. Those incidentally are from the superintendent of schools.
Mm.
You can just see how little that guarantee was worth by what happened with those were specific references to the elementary world language money.
Right.
And I'm not sure if the schools have lived up to all their previous override commitments or if the town has, but that stands out like a sore thumb.
Yeah.
Even though, relatively, few people followed it as closely as I did, having served on that committee and monitored all of these promises to live up to those commitments. And I know it's only a one-year legal guarantee. And I also noticed that the mayor of Newton in the 22-23 override campaign said, yes, it's only a one-year legal guarantee, but I pledge we will never break this. And you can hold our feet to the fire. Of course, that override failed in Newton in 2023, despite those promises.
Yep.
So I would just like your thoughts on that issue. And I don't know if there are any plans under consideration to not spend prior override funds as promised at the time, or how you make this case to people that they should vote for an override now when we have one glaring example of schools kept the money and dropped the program.
Right. It's true. And I think there's a messaging issue there too, right? I think how the world languages program the K-5 aspect of the world languages program came out of the school's budget really needed needed a better message, because it wound up being positioned as this. So it's a it's a cut. It's being made for budgetary reasons and not for operational reasons. They didn't do a good job of messaging the work that they had done to figure out if that program was successful, and if not, what could be done in its place. They didn't message that out to the community in a way that was successful. And so I think then they are, then stuck with that narrative, which is, oh, you promised in 2009 that we would maintain this commitment, and then we cut the program. And you cut it, the people think it's for budget reasons. And I think certainly on the town side, we have been keeping that commitment, even when it's been hard to do so. For example, in the 2023 override, we committed $2 million for roadways, because we knew that was a commitment the community wanted us to make. Even in having to reduce the CIP, which has been very hard, we've been able to keep that commitment to roadways. We've been able to keep those dollars, where people have asked us to keep them. That does mean less money available for other projects, but it also means that we're keeping our commitment to that override. I think it's important for us to be able to message, the success of past investments in overrides. I think it's important to look at, all the things that we have pledged to do, like, for example, rodent control. I know that's a source of constant, municipal consternation, right? How are we controlling the rats? And the answer is we've actually done a really good job of figuring out what works and what doesn't. We actually have a much more robust enforcement program than we used to. We are much more rapid response than we used to be. I'm always impressed at the work that both the health department and DPW do now that we have this program in place. And that was only made possible because of the override.
Just to interject, Chess, I'm very impressed by Stephanie Aucoin at DPW and what she's doing.
Yes.
I can't say I'm not impressed by the health department, because I haven't quite figured out so clearly who at the health department has specific responsibility for that. But at least there's an effort in both departments, and that's great.
And I think, John Kosinski, who's our new public health director, is really, he's really taking this on. He's really jumped in both feet first in terms of this issue, thinking like, all right, we've had this program in place for the last 3 years. What works and what doesn't? Let's spend our money on solutions that we know are effective, and let's not invest money in things that aren't working. Let's focus rodent control on proven solutions. And he's really doing great work with Stephanie and the whole team to try and make that happen. So it's a valid question. I think it comes down to, one, messaging when things don't go the way you expect them to go, and two, otherwise holding fast to those commitments, as I think the town has.
Yeah, and just for the record, I think the town is still spending the 1994 override, I guess maybe fiscal 95, but voted in 94, whenever, way back then, on the trucks and other things that were listed then.
That's right.
Though the real value of that money, of course, is not what it used to be.
Correct. But yes, that investment was made, and it's still there.
Okay, well, I appreciate your taking the time to answer the questions and make the presentation. And if the slides or whatever are available, I will circulate them as widely as I can too. And I'll be in touch about the tree CIP item there in the open space and conservation category.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone who came out, and to everyone watching remotely. Take care, everyone.